Alright. Ek gaan net miskien vinnig die inleiding in Afrikaans doen. Um uh, baie dankie vir die uitnodiging eerstens van die U3I komitee af. Dis maar altyd lekker om deur te kom hier na Stilbaai toe. Dit is eintlik so 'n pragtige wêreld. Ek kan heeltemal verstaan hoekom julle hier bly. So baie dankie vir die uitnodiging. En dan bring ek ook maar groete van ons tak af van die U3I George Wilderness. Ons is nou nie heeltemal so groot soos julle nie. Ek hoor julle is omtrent 400 lede. Ons is maar so 240 lede. So julle stel ons eintlik in die skande. As jy dink hoeveel groter is George eintlik as wat Stilbaai is. So alles van die beste vir julle ook dan vorentoe ook oor Kerstydperk en vorentoe. Soos genoem, my naam is Johan Viljoen. Ek gaan die praatjie hoofsaaklik eintlik heeltemal in Engels doen. As daar op enige stadium egter 'n vraag is en jy wil iets in Afrikaans vra, iets was onduidelik of dit, vra gerus in Afrikaans. Ek sal my bes doen om ook in Afrikaans dan te antwoord. The reason I'm giving it in English, amongst others, is that a lot of the terms obviously come from the British Navy, from the Royal Navy, where a lot of our traditions and customs come from. So a lot of those things are really English and English language, so to try and translate them is actually very difficult. As mentioned, I was in the Navy for 28 years. I was initially a seagoing officer and then later went over across to the intelligence branch. So we had a look at what other navies were doing in the vicinity. And we were also very fortunate to be able to spend 2.5 years in Chile in South America, where I was the naval attaché. So I had a really, very good career, and I enjoyed it tremendously. So I still am very much a maritime person at heart. So this is really a talk that's close to my heart and that I really enjoyed researching. So let's go. Naval customs and traditions. What I'm going to be talking about just is a little bit is what is the difference between a custom and a tradition, very briefly. Why are they important? Why are customs and traditions important? Often, guys that we did in the national service in the army or the air force think the Navy is totally strange with all these different customs and everything else, but that's what makes us unique. And I'm just going to be saying something about why it's important. Then I'm going to be talking something about formal customs that you could find aboard ship or terms that are used aboard ship, uniform, saluting, then something a little less formal, social customs and the use of alcohol, everybody's favorite subject, and something about naval toasts. Then something about sayings and terms. Where do these terms come from? Some of them have been taken up into everyday language where people often don't realize that they actually have their origins in the Navy or maritime. A couple of comments as a conclusion. And then as mentioned, I'm going to just be just updating you on the preservation of SAS Assegai. For those that perhaps weren't at that talk or can't remember that far back, I understand fully, being that age too. The SAS Assegai was one of the original 3 submarines that we brought from France in the 1970s. It's been taken out of service and it was going to be scrapped. And as with a lot of these things, a small group of dedicated people with lots of enthusiasm and hard work managed to preserve it and turn it into a museum. So that on its own is actually a very interesting story, but I'll just update you on that then as well. Most of our customs and traditions really have their origins in the Royal Navy of the United Kingdom. Obviously, having been a colony of the United Kingdom, all our training initially and that was done in the Royal Navy in the UK. Over time, obviously, we've developed some of our own customs and traditions. And many of them are old customs and traditions, so often they're referring to sailing ships, is where they had their origin. So a lot of these come from the 1800s. A custom is generally can often be a relatively simple thing. So it's a salute or it's something like that. So it's a fairly thing that's come over time, whereas a tradition is generally, and this is just a generalization really, where a tradition often has deeper roots and has come a long way before. Why is it important? Because it makes us unique. It binds the sailors together. We're a unique group, different to others. It fosters a sense of pride and identity of being a Navy person or a Navy member. And really, it also contributes to the effectiveness and the professionalism by what it does and the fact that it imparts this pride in the Navy. I'm sure a lot of you have been on cruises before and or have been on a passenger ship. So this is the first part of the test. And please take note, before you be able to leave this afternoon or this morning, there's going to be a little test that you have to do before you can get out. So please take note. All right, for those that have been aboard a ship, and Karel, jy mag nie iets sê nie. Those that have been on a cruise ship, and I remember there was in the Navy wat vlootopleiding gedoen het, jy mag ook nie sê nie. If you're standing on a ship and you're looking out towards the front of the ship, that's this side here. What is the side on the right called? Starboard, there we go. I can see this is a very sharp audience. And on the left-hand side, port, there we go. Sorry, get back. There we go. Just one more. Yeah, so it's port on the port side. We're going to be explaining just a little bit of background about where these different terms come from. The bow, the pointy end up front, and what's the flat part at the back? The stern, that's it. And where do they control the ship from? The bridge, there we go. There's the bridge. So those are basic terms that I just wanted to go through with you, and just a little short explanation on where they came from. Starboard came from the Old English word steerboard, which meant steerboard, or the side on which the boat was steered. And a gondola is probably one of the best examples of that. You see the oar is on the right-hand side or on the starboard side. So that is actually how it came about. The steerboard, where the steering and the propulsion then in this case was done as well, on the right-hand side, the starboard side. Port was actually called larboard originally, but starboard, larboard, if the wind's blowing and everything else, or you're up in the sails, can often be fairly confusing. So they decided that larboard is too close to starboard, and you're going to create confusion. So they changed it to port. It was the side of the ship which was generally then alongside the quay. In the port, alongside the quay, where they did the offloading, which made sense as well because you had the steering gear on the right-hand side, on the starboard. So it was a good choice, the port side. The bow, from the Old English word bog, which is a curve, as you can see there, the curve, where it got its name from, bog. And then the stern, from the old Norwegian word, in fact, stjorm, meaning steering. Obviously, at the stern is where the rudder is, and the rudder determines the direction you're actually going into. The bridge is where the captain of the ship is, and where the ship is actually steered from. And it originated from the first. Sorry, going too quickly. Let's try again. There we go. It originated from the first steam-powered ships were actually paddle wheel steamers, and they had a paddle wheel on each side, on the port and on the starboard side. And they built a little platform so that the officers could move from the one side of the ship to the other, so that they could see what was happening. Were these paddle wheels turning? Was there a problem? So they walked across this way, a thwartships they call it, and it was like a little bridge, hence the name bridge, and the name bridge stuck. So that's to give them an unobstructed view of the ship going forward. The heads, or the toilet, you can see these guys sitting here in the heads, in the front of the ship. Geen skaamte. Obviously there were no women aboard or anything else. That's where the guys did their thing. The main reason why it was up in the front part of the ship, and this is where it actually was, this is how it worked. The front part of the ship, because these sailing ships generally couldn't sail directly into the wind, you always had the wind coming from the side or from the stern, so it was a very good idea to have the toilets up front, blow all the wind away and all the smells which go along with it. And also the front side of the ship, with the movement of a ship, of a sailing ship moving up and down like this, it got the washed clear every now and then, hopefully. So it was up in the head of the ship, in the front part of the ship. So it became known as the heads, and that's where the word come from, the heads. And the heads, the Navy term is still very much used aboard ship even now. The heads is where the toilets and the bathrooms. Is it a ship? No, it's a boat. Okay, I'm sure you've all heard a number of things, or perhaps you haven't heard of people correcting anyone about what's a boat and what's a ship. Generally, boats are fairly small water vessels designed to operate on restricted water areas, in a dam, on a river, that kind of thing. Or sometimes they do go to sea, obviously, as a ski boat. Generally, they're not that advanced in terms of machinery. A boat cannot carry a ship. A ship can carry a boat, and I'll explain that to you now. They're often used for recreational purposes or fishing. The crew of the boat depends on the size of the boat. A ship, on the other hand, is generally much larger. It sails in deep waterways from one ocean to another. They have fairly complex designed machines and machinery. A ship can carry a boat, one or more boats. Okay, lifeboat. So a ship can carry a boat, but it can't work the other way around. A boat can't carry a ship. It's mainly used for commercial, military, research, or other purposes. And because it's a lot more complex, the number of crew that you need is a lot more, and they need to have some fairly good background as far as engineering or whatever the case is actually. So is it a ship or is it a boat? These distinctions, of course, as with every good story, there are exceptions to every rule. All right, so it's not cast in stone by any way, in any means. Here you can see the ship carrying boats, and that is actually the Royal Yacht Britannia, used by the royal family in the United Kingdom, now taken out of service, and it's in Edinburgh. So if ever you get there, that's a very interesting visit as well. And here you see a ship carrying another ship. So it's not always the case. This is in fact a ship, United States Navy ship that was actually had a bomb detonated next to it, and there you can see the hole in the ship. So it's being carried piggyback style back to the US. It was actually the attack took place in Aden, and it's being taken back to the US for repairs. Submarines, however, are always called boats. Originally, they were fairly small, so they were actually launched from a ship into the water, so they were called boats. And that is still the case, irrespective of how big the submarine. If you look at this nuclear-powered, a Russian nuclear-powered submarine, gives you some indication that's the size of the crew there. So it is huge, okay, but it's still called a boat, as all submarines are called. Why is a ship called she? I'm sure you might have seen these on drying cloths and everything else, perhaps here in Stilbaai as well. It's because there's always a great deal of bustle around her. There's usually a gang of men about. She has a waist and stays. Takes a lot of paint to keep good looking, and it's not the initial expense that gets you, it's the upkeep. She can be all decked out. It takes an experienced man to handle her correctly, and without a man at the helm, she's absolutely uncontrollable. She shows her top sides, hides her bottom, and when coming into port, she always heads for the buoys. All right, so that's actually quite a good description. But in reality, there's no certainty actually why they refer to as she, why a ship is called she. There are a couple of possibilities. The nurturing, protective role, as a mother protects her brood, so a ship protects the crew. In language, often associated with femininity is beauty and grace and that kind of thing. And if you find a sailor who really loves his ship and loves what he's doing, he'll tell you how beautiful it is. So it could have come from the language as well. It was often also a feminine symbol, a symbol of feminism. It was also a superstitious belief at one stage that treating a vessel as a female entity would bring good luck. And obviously these terms come from a long time ago, so appeasing and superstition were obviously very important in those days. Why ship is called she. The ship's bell is used for indicating time, especially in the days of sailing ships. Was used you ring it a certain number of times to tell you what the time is. It's usually made of brass or bronze, and it generally has the name of the ship engraved on it, as well as the year that it came into service. This again is the yacht Britannia, His Majesty's Yacht Britannia, that I showed you just now as well, and it was launched in 1953. So that's the ship's bell. It can also be used for baptizing children of the crew. It's actually turned upside down and filled with water, so it's used as a baptismal font. The child is baptized, and then generally they engrave the name of the child on the inside of the bell as well. Just as you know, a ship is different to a lot of other transport means. A ship is sailing 24 hours a day. So it's a 24/7 operation, and you can't have the same guys on the bridge or operating the equipment, the engines, and etc. You can't have the same guys on duty all the time. So they operate what they term a watch-keeping system. So when you're on duty, you are on watch. Personnel keep watch, and it's in various locations. So you have some guys up on the bridge doing the navigation. Others are in the engine room, making sure the engines are working, and there's others all around the ship as well. And that's watchkeeping. Here's just to illustrate it. Good luck. Here we go. And to show you just a couple of other facts about sailing ships.
Combat at sea was relatively rare. Great fleet actions, such as Trafalgar and the Nile, were rarer still. Just a handful of days spread across 20 years of war. Weeks and months often lay between any encounter with the enemy. Then life at sea was dominated by naval routine, and the passage of time marked by the ship's bell. The naval day began at noon, determined by the officers' observation of the sun with their sextants. The moment the sun reached its highest point was noon. The ship's hourglass was turned, and the bell rung 8 times to mark the beginning of the afternoon watch. Half an hour later, as determined by a half-hour sandglass, the bell was rung once. A half hour later, it was rung twice, and so on. So 5 bells in the afternoon watch was 2:30 p.m. 8 bells meant the start of a new watch, sending half the crew below deck to rest or do other tasks, and bringing the other half on duty. There were 7 watches in all, though the first and second dog watches were only 2 hours long. This meant the 2 halves of the crew switched their routine each day, and one half wasn't always stuck with the same night watches. Senior officers slept in a hanging cot. For everyone else, bed was a hammock strung up from the ship's beams. Most of the men slept on the middle or lower gun decks, their hammocks suspended between the guns, just 16 inches apart. But as most ships operated a 2-watch system, half the crew on duty while the other half slept, about half the hammocks were empty at any given time.
Aboard a sailing ship, especially the living arrangement. On to the next subject is the bosun's call, and this is actually one. It was mentioned here as well. This is a bosun's call, and when it's used aboard ship, it's a whistle that's used by the bosun, who's in charge of the deck work. And it has a very high-pitched sound. The idea with the bosun's call was that you could hear it above wave action, you could hear about waves breaking above the wind. If you're up high in the mast somewhere, to get a message to you, they would generally use the bosun's call. This is what it sounded like. So you could see it fairly penetrating of everything. It's also used in the morning to wake everybody up and to make sure they get up in the morning. Perhaps just another interesting aspect is a knot. If you have been on a cruise or that, they might tell you how many knots the ship is doing. So it's a measurement of speed. And what it is actually 1 nautical mile per hour is a knot. All right, a nautical mile is also different to a land mile, but we won't go into that now. It's a nautical mile, so 1 nautical mile per hour is a knot. And this really has its origin in knots. A line like this was wound on a reel, and a log was attached to the end. Wood. The log was thrown overboard, and the number of knots that passed through the hands of a sailor over a specific period of time was counted to determine the ship's speed. So the knots were going through the guy's hands, and hence the name stuck, knot, to give you an indication of speed. And what is interesting as well is, if you perhaps can recall, that they don't always mention it in knots, but aircraft speed is also in knots. And in fact, a number of customs from ships was actually taken over with the first aircraft. So if you think about it, what side of an aircraft do you go aboard? The general rule when you get onto an aircraft is the left side, the port side. That's correct. So what happened was that some of the larger, first large aircraft for passenger carrying, a lot of them were flying boats. So it made a bit of sense that they used some of the terminology from the maritime world to aircraft and flying. The captain of a ship, the captain of an aircraft, the lights that they would show at night port would have a red light, and on the starboard side would be a green light, exactly as you have on a ship. So a lot of the terms were actually carried over to aircraft. Visual communications, generally, if ships are in sight of one another, they could use a lamp like this with Morse code or by means of flags. Although there's lots of satellite communication and everything else, it's still a custom that's used, and it's still used aboard ship between ships that are obviously close enough that you can see one another. What it is, the advantage is with a normal radio, as soon as you start using a radio, it's a transmitter, so a signal goes out in all directions, so it can be picked up and detected by other ships. So with this means you're fairly certain that your communication is not being intercepted by anybody else. There's also another way of communicating from the old days, is what's termed a flag hoist, where you hoist flags onto the masts. And this is probably one of the most famous flag hoists, especially if you're from the maritime world. It's what was flown and hoisted by Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Just before the onset or the start of the battle, he said that England expects that every man will do his duty. And this is the way it was actually put together on the flags and flown. There we go. England expects that every man will do his duty, is made up of a couple of flags. So if there wasn't one specific flag that had a certain meaning, or something like duty didn't have a certain flag, you actually made up the flags for a specific word. So Nelson, you may also not know that he was actually killed although the Royal Navy was successful against the French and the Spanish, Nelson was killed, in fact, at the battle aboard his ship HMS Victory. And if you've been to London, you would have seen Trafalgar Square, you would have seen Nelson's column. That's all in fact part of the battle, or subsequent to the battle. Those were all erected. Uniforms generally are blue or black in the Navy, most of the navies. And in 1857 only did the Admiralty of the United Kingdom, for the Royal Navy, actually determined for the first time that a uniform was to be worn. Before that, everybody wore what they could or had. And they found that blue indigo was a very good material and color that didn't wash out easily. So they went for blue and white. Let's just go back quickly, sorry. White was the natural color for cotton, so that was an easy choice as well. So generally in the tropics, or where it's hot, the uniform would be white, and in colder climates would be blue or black, as we have it and as we wear in the South African Navy and many others. Bell-bottom trousers, and this is the photograph that was actually sent with when giving background about the talk. Sailors had bell-bottom trousers for a very good reason. If you're working with water and everything else, and you wanted to turn up your pants so that you don't get your pants wet, it's going to be fairly difficult if you're wearing the skin-tight jeans that you are today. So they had a flare at the bottom, bell-bottom. You could turn it up fairly easily. So there was actually a very good reason for bell-bottoms. This is an old photograph on a ship that actually has wooden decks, and these guys were actually cleaning the deck, and lots of water obviously was being sprayed on the deck from the sea. So to keep your pants dry, you turn them up, and they were bell-bottomed. Saluting, there's various ways of salutes. I'm sure you've all seen saluting in movies or whatever, or you've been through it yourself. It's a way of showing military respect. It can be with a hand, it can be with a sword, it can be with guns aboard ships. So there are various ways of doing it. In 1882, the Royal Navy instituted a salute for the first time, and it was to touch the brim of the hat, and so that's how it got the origin. Generally, the palm faces outwards. You can see here, Air Force and Army, the palm faces outward. The navies, shows it facing inward. And it said that in 1890, Queen Victoria, while inspecting sailors, was horrified at the sight of their tar-stained hands, and ordered that in future the Navy salute was to be done with the offending palms facing inward. All right. Obviously, in the days of sailing ships, they used a lot of tar. A lot of tar was used on the deck between the seams and everything else to make them watertight. So you can imagine they continually had this tar on their hands, and you didn't have all the fancy soaps that we have today and the clean green. So I'm sure their hands were fairly tar stained continually or almost all the time. Whether this is in fact true, we're not sure. All right, so, but we don't want to spoil a good story with facts, so we'll say it's true. This is how it came about. It would certainly make sense. Sorry. Gun salutes. Gun salutes had their origin really in the days of sailing ships, and when you had to actually load a cannon from the front. So a ship arriving in a new port or a foreign port would fire its guns, which would indicate it came in peace. So for them to have to reload the guns to actually carry out an attack would be very difficult. So they fired off their guns to show that they had intent, they came in peace, and the firing of the guns from the ship would be followed by firing of guns from the port side, acknowledging them as well. So a gun salute would be fired. So this is what a gun salute would looks like on a modern warship. Obviously, it's just a small saluting gun, so you don't actually use your main armament to fire guns with. Old regulations stipulated that a ship must fire 7 guns and a battery on land 3 rounds for each of the 7. So you have the 7 times 3 is 21, and that's where you actually got the 21 gun salute from. That's still used now for visiting heads of state or on other occasions, the 21 gun salute. Our favorite subject, here we go, the alcohol. The issuing of beer and rum actually comes a very long way in the Royal Navy. And one of the primary reasons for that was because of the preservation qualities of alcohol. So, which you're saying all the time. Beer and rum with the alcoholic content acted as preservatives, helping to keep the water from spoiling. Okay, once you've made it beer, then it's no longer actually water. But obviously, in those days, water was carried aboard in casks. So you often had ships at sea for weeks or months on end, unable to get fresh water. So you can imagine after it's been in these casks, after a couple of months, it certainly wasn't great to drink, not at all. So they decided that one of the ways to preserve it is to add alcohol. However, as you can imagine, issuing alcohol aboard a ship, you're sure to get a couple of challenges, intoxication and everything else. So that was a good solution as far as keeping it fresh, but it certainly also had its challenges. In 1731, sailors were given their first alcohol ration, and this is in the Royal Navy. Crews were issued with 8 pints of beer per day or a half a pint of rum. All right, it wasn't quite as strong as the rum and the beer that we use today, so not quite that strong. But you'd see it would also be in casks like this. And it ages as your wine ages and as your whiskey and all the other spirits that are used in casks as well. In 1740, Admiral Edward Vernon ordered that the rum be watered down, and it was from then on called grog. So up spirits was piped on board the ship at about 11 a.m., between 11 a.m. and noon. The call for up spirits would be made, and the various representatives from the messes where the sailors stayed. There's a mess for the various musterings aboard. So there's one for the seamen, one for the gunners, etc. So they would send their messman up to the upper deck. He'd take along his container, and then they would issue the rum accordingly. You see here it says grog, and the king, God bless him for the rum, I'm sure. So they would then collect it, and they would take it down to their mess to be enjoyed. If there was a special occasion, extra rum might be issued if they had completed a fairly strenuous task or they'd been victorious in a battle. They'd issue an extra tot of rum, and that was called splicing the main brace. Well, you may have heard of that term as well. So that's where it comes from, up spirit. The Navy followed on with, with the United Kingdom's Royal Navy. We issued rum as well. But in 1954, it was decided that why import expensive rum when we have all this brandy here that we're selling very cheaply? So the South African Navy switched to brandy at that stage, and one tot, a senior rating, that's a senior non-commissioned officer aboard, would get half a gill or 1/8 of a pint or about 50 milliliters undiluted. Ratings of 20 years of age would get half a gill or diluted 2 parts of water to 1 part of rum, or actually not rum there, that should now read brandy. All right, so there we switched. You can see the uniforms at this time in the 1950s was very much a German influence. Obviously, 1948, when the National Party took over, there was a major effort to do away with all the Anglo-Saxon customs, although luckily some stayed, and uniforms and etc. were also changed to be more South African, and this was actually very much like a German uniform, in fact. Black Dot Day, on the 28th of January 1970, the British Parliament decided to do away with the rum. It was obviously felt that with the modern warships, with all this high technology stuff aboard and everything else, and the chance of starting a nuclear configuration, nuclear war, it's best not to have alcohol aboard or issue it too regularly. So they decided to do away with it, and on the 31st of July 1970, the last tot of rum was issued in the Royal Navy, and that day became known as Black Dot Day. So hence it's celebrated still now on the 31st of July, a tot of rum, or at least something to celebrate Black Dot Day, or actually to commiserate with Black Dot Day, the day they did away with the sailors' rum. Often aboard ship, most navies had a traditional drinking toast, which is delivered by the youngest officer in the wardroom, which is the officer's quarters, after the toast to the head of state. So here you see in the wardroom, in the officer's quarters, this must be quite a big ship if you see how many officers are here. So this is now after dinner, everybody's had dinner, all spruced up. They've taken all the other stuff away, and here's the 2 decanters with port. It's passed around. It's time for the toast. They toast the head of state. And after that, it's time for the junior member of the wardroom to now to raise and propose a toast. And these are some of the original toasts that we used. And as I say, these are old days when there were no women aboard, and so they're not gender sensitive at all. Okay, on Monday it would generally be our ships at sea. On Tuesdays, our men. Wednesdays, ourselves, and the refrain, as no one else is likely to concern themselves with our welfare. On Thursdays, bloody war and quick promotion. On Friday, a willing foe and sea room, obviously, if you need sea room, if you're in a sailing ship. On Saturday, wives and sweethearts, also with a refrain, may they never meet. And on Sundays, absent friends and those at sea. So those were the traditional toasts that we used. Obviously, they have now a much more gender-sensitive toasts now that there are women aboard warships as well. In the submarine service, as I mentioned just now when we spoke about the SS Assegai, the submarines, our initial submarines were from France. So there are a couple of French traditions that also came along with the submarines. And what they did was for the person aboard, a new person aboard the submarine, they would dive the submarine to 300 meters, which is the crushing, which is the safe depth, 300 meters of the under the water. They would obviously the new recruit is fairly apprehensive because by this time he's been told about all these leaking parts and the rivets popping and everything else. So he's in a fairly nervous state. What they would do then is to actually tap water or take water at 300 meters and put it into a glass, and you would have to down the glass as a glass of champagne. And here's just an example of somebody downing a glass of champagne seawater. As far as sayings and terms is concerned, that's I'm just going to move on to now. Really, it's a collective term, and there are some very unique sayings and traditions. As I mentioned, some of them have become used in everyday English now as well. And obviously, for coming from those days, profanity was, although we won't be using any of those sayings, profanity and innuendo were commonplace. As you can imagine, just with a bunch of sailors, as was humor. So as the saying goes, if you can't take a joke, you shouldn't have joined. So that was even in my day as well. This is another interesting one. Posh, where does the term posh come from? In the old days of the colonies, when Britain ruled the world, and the sun never set on the British Empire, when you went out to the India or the other colonies in the east, when you sailed from the UK, you would want to be on the port side, port out, because then at least if you did get close to land, you would be able to see it as opposed just to looking out over the sea. So going out, you would be on the port side, that would be the better cabin. Coming back, you would like to be on the starboard side because there you can see the land on your starboard side. So what you were looking for was port out and starboard home. So that was the term POSH, P-O-S-H. Again, this is possibly an explanation, but it certainly makes sense. It certainly is a good one, POSH, the word POSH. The son of a gun. Women were allowed on board Royal Navy ships in port in the 19th century, and debauchery and a lot of other things on the gun decks was a common occurrence. There were even babies born between decks, and a male child born on the gun deck and father often unknown became known as the son of a gun. Yeah, you can see, as I said, you mentioned just now in the video as well, they slept between the guns. So this is the guns here and the gun deck, and this is where the table was and where they actually ate and lived. And then obviously at night, the hammocks were slung above the guns. To shape or show a leg, and yeah, you can see all the hammocks that were shown just now as well, between the guns. Women were allowed to sleep aboard. Once the sailors had got up, they were allowed to stay in the hammock. And when somebody came into the mess and they started trying to see if there were any sailors still in bed, they'd say, show a leg. And the person in the hammock, sorry, old age, in the hammock would show a leg. So you could see if it's a man or a woman's leg. So show a leg, or shake a leg to see who's actually still in the hammock. To tow the line, when the ship's company was mustered for pay, here it was in the old days, you didn't have bank accounts and all that. You actually stood the whole ship's company on the upper deck. The ship's company was mustered for pay. Each sailor stepped forward to a line marked on the deck, toe behind the line, and placed sufficiently far away from the paymaster's table so that the sailor could not sweep the whole table's money into his cap as he leaned forward to scoop up his pay. So there was a line there, so you had to toe the line to do what you're supposed to. The cat o' nine tails is also an interesting one. It's actually an instrument of punishment. So this is what a cat o' nine tails looks like. And obviously it has 9 tails, and that's obviously where you held it, and it was used for punishment, for whipping. So it was kept in a red baize bag, so that once you actually used it for whipping, they didn't wash it, put it back in the baize bag, and you didn't actually see the color. So it was put in the bag, hence the expression, the cat's out of the bag, which still means retribution is imminent. It's also associated with the phrase hardly room to swing a cat, which implies that the space being described is somewhat cramped. So you'd be pleased to know that it's got nothing to do with swinging around a real cat. All right, so the cat of 9 tails is actually where the term and the saying comes from. Now, a little bit quick off the mark. Here we go. Another, your true colors is another saying that's taken up in everyday language. False colors, if you were in a battle, like you had 2 ships, false colors were permitted during an approach to another ship, but the true nationality colors had to be broken out once battle was joined. So it was acceptable to fly another country's flag to try and confuse the enemy, but once you actually close up and you start firing on another ship, you had to raise your own flag. You had to show your true colors. And this is an example of that. It's a bit soft, unfortunately. This is from the movie Master and Commander with Russell Crowe. They fly and they hoist their own colors. Obviously British. Opening the ports for the guns. Very close. This is those bloody wars that you hope for quick promotion. If you want to watch a good realistic movie about those days, Master and Commander is actually very true fact. And one of the things that always did was try and go for the mast of another ship, because obviously once your mast has fallen, which is going to happen here now, it's no longer possible for you to move with the ship. You can't steer it, so it becomes very difficult. So the other mast collapses. And there is the bosun's call. Just in conclusion then, just a couple of light-hearted points as well. Often when you're in the Navy or any other service, or perhaps even other posts, the guys tend to exaggerate about how long they've actually been in the service. Specifically here we're talking about the Navy. So he was in the service when Long John Silver only had an egg on his shoulder. You may recall Long John Silver is a pirate of old, and he was always seen with a parrot on his shoulder. So this guy's been in the service in the Navy for so long. He's when Long John Silver only had an egg on his shoulder, this guy's been in the Navy that long. Or you could say Bill took the King Shilling when Victory was still part of Epping Forest. Obviously what they're referring to there is HMS Victory, the flagship of Nelson. So before it was even built, when it was still part of Epping Forest, before they cut the trees down to build the ship, this guy had already been in the Navy. So long before. Mike led the firefighting party that dealt with the burning bush. All right, that's how long he's been in the Navy. So the firefighting party is obviously a term for guys aboard ship have been designated as a firefighting party. So he was involved with the firefighting party that had to put out the burning bush. So he's been around a very, very long time. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the part on the customs and traditions. Before I say something about Assegai, I don't know if anybody has any comments or questions. You're most welcome. Dion.
Give us a demonstration of that whistle.
Oh no, not today. Oh, that's why I had the video call or the video clip. No, it's actually quite complicated to, and I haven't used it for many years. It's a fairly small whistle, and by opening and closing it, you can make different sounds. Because obviously for various instructions that you're trying to send to anybody else, you're making a different sound with different short and longer blasts, for example, higher or lower pitch. So yeah, it's a fairly complicated thing to actually blow. So it takes a while before you actually master the art. Don't know if there's anything else, anybody? All right, perhaps in the, sorry, yes.
Waarvoor staan die afkortings achter die name? Triple M of
dit is medaljename. So, dit is afkortings vir medaljes wat aan mense gegee word. So die MMM is 'n military merit medal. So dis vir goeie diens wat verrig is. As jy in die weermag is. Natuurlik al daai medaljes het nou verander, natuurlik die afkorting daar agter. Daar's nou 'n klomp ander medaljes wat bygekom het en daai tipe goeder. So ja, dis afkortings van medaljes wat seker medaljes mag jy die afkorting na jou naam skryf, maar ook nie almal nie. Jong Karel.
Can you just comment on what Captain Keane said when I worked with him? He said there are only two types of ships, submarines and targets.
Quite, yeah, that is very much a submariner saying. There's only two kinds of ships, although that's a boat. There are two kinds of ships, either submarines or targets. So you're either in a submarine or you're a target for a submarine. Obviously, it's very popular amongst the submariners. Just of interest, yeah. So let's go on to Assegai. If there aren't any other questions, yeah, at the back certainly. If we're talking about during the Second World War, or yeah. That's another talk for another day. In fact, if they invite me back, I have a talk about also, sorry, Karel, not to blow my own trumpet, you don't have to invite me. No, a talk on Axis submarine operations off the South African coast. So now, during the war, a number of German and Italian submarines operated along our coast. There were a couple of Japanese as well. The Germans obviously were the biggest navy that operated off the coast. And in total, they sank during the Second World War about 136 ships. Were sunk but within 1,000 nautical miles of the South African coast. So they certainly were very, very active along the South African coast, certainly, and in 1942, 1943. By 1944, the situation in Germany had become very difficult, so the sinkings along our coast diminished drastically, and by 1945, as you can imagine, towards the end of the war. There were obviously they knew about submarines by the number of ships that were sunk and sightings at sea. There were a number of rumors and everything else about submarines surfacing along the coast and guys flashing lights at them and sending signals with torches, and the guys coming ashore from the German submarines and landing here. but there's actually no evidence, in fact, of any of that happening. There was, for those of you that are also history buffs, you may know the name Roby Leibrand, who was a boxer in South Africa, a very famous boxer, and actually represented South Africa at the Olympics in 1936, when Hitler was already obviously in power, and he was very impressed by the Germans, and he was a member of the Ossewa Brandwacht. So they trained him up in Germany and then brought him back to South Africa to carry out sabotage. But he, in fact, they actually sailed on with a sailboat all the way to off the South African coast to drop him, to put him ashore. So there's no evidence of anybody actually coming ashore. One of the probably the most outlandish stories of or rumors about submarines offshore was the one that a submarine surfaced at Bakhoven in the Cape, and the guys put ashore. And then they caught the bus to go into the city centre of Cape Town and to watch a movie there so that they could improve the English. So there were lots. That's probably the most extreme one. But for a submarine to come too close to shore is always dangerous, especially if the water is shallow. Of course, one of the main ways for a submarine to get away, if it's been detected, is to dive deep and make lots of turns and evasive maneuvers. But obviously, if you're in a fairly shallow area, you can't dive much. So it's always very dangerous to be in a shallow area. Initially, at the outbreak especially of the German submarine campaign, we were not prepared for submarines really. They did in fact surface off Cape Town, had a good look around in Cape Town and everything else, and then went out and actually in the deeper water sank a number of ships. So yeah, there's no physical evidence of a submarine or a submarine having been sunk close to the coast. They've all been a fairly far away from the coast. Is there anything else? Yes. It comes from the German Unterseeboot. So with the anglicizing of it, they just went for U-boat. A U-boat. Unterseeboot is actually the name. Yeah. Yes. Okay, wat range betref, 'n kaptein in die vloot is gelykstaande aan 'n kolonel in die leer of die lugmag. Hulle het ander range. Die vloot, weerdeel van die tradisies ensovoorts, het hulle eie range, kaptein, kommandeur, luitenant, kommandeur ensovoorts. En dit kan die leer en die lugmag ouens nooit regkry om dit te onthou nie, want hulle sien so min vlooties, so hulle kan nooit die vlootrange onthou nie. Maar 'n vlootkaptein is ekwivalent van 'n kolonel. In die leer of in die lugmag of die mediese diens, dis die ander deel. En natuurlik oor die Esmeralda. Die Esmeralda was eintlik 'n Chileense vlootopleidingsskip, 'n seilskip, wat hulle nog steeds gebruik in Chili. En ons het 'n geleentheid gehad ook. Ons het van tyd tot tyd ons van ons studente soontoe stuur na Chili toe, waar hulle aan boord die Esmeralda dan gedien het. Dis 'n seilskip. Baie vlote sê natuurlik om opleiding te kry op 'n seilskip is eintlik die beste. Daar het jy baie meer te doen met die wind en die weer, en dis baie meer belangrik dat jy dit verstaan, hoe die wind en die weer en sovoorts werk, en jy moet teen die maste opgaan om die seile te laat sak of op te neem. So baie lande dink nog dat 'n opleidingsskip 'n seilskip moet wees. So die Chileane het nog beslis Esmeralda, en een keer 'n jaar vat hulle kadette op 'n redelike lang toer. Hulle vat 'n vaart, miskien Europa toe self of waar ook al. So hulle gebruik die Esmeralda beslis nog, ja. So hulle vat hulle klomp vlootkadette wat onder opleiding is, vat hulle aan boord, en hulle het natuurlik hulle eie permanente bemanning ook, wat die masjinerie kyk en al daai goeders, maar dan beman die kadette die res van die skip. So, maar dit is definitief nog in gebruik, en as 'n hele paar ander vlote wat ook seilskepe gebruik vir opleiding. Ja. Ja, ek dink ek het ook die boek gelees. Ja, hy was 'n baie moeilike klant om dit sagkens te stel. So hulle was baie bly. Ek dink hulle sou hom oorboord gegooi het as hy nie daar afgeklim het nie. So dit was hier langs die Weskus waar hy afgelaai is. So julle is Ossewa Brandwag is ook 'n ander storie. Alright. Okay, miskien net ietsie oor die Assegaai. Die Assegaai is in 1971 het hy in diens gekom, het die deel geword van die Suid-Afrikaanse vloot en aanvanklik as die SAS Johanna van der Merwe. SAS staan vir Suid-Afrikaanse skip of South African ship. So meeste vlote het so 'n afkorting wat hulle voor hulle skepe se name het. HMS sal staan vir die Britse vloot staan as daar 'n koningin aan bewind is, dan is dit Her Majesty ship. So dit was vir baie jare Her Majesty ship terwyl koningin Elizabeth op die troon was. Nou met Charles op die troon is dit His Majesty ship. So al hulle skepe het HMS voor. Ons in SAS, Suid-Afrikaanse skip Johanna van der Merwe. So dit is toe sy te water gelaat is. Hier is sy in Lorient in Frankryk waar sy gebou is. Jy kan sien dit is nog van die ou duikboot van die Duitse duikbote, die skanse wat opgerig is vir hulle waar hulle binne gewerk het wat bestand was teen aanvalle, meeste aanvalle van die geallieerdes. So hier is die SAS Johanna van der Merwe en is in 1971 in diens geneem. Ons het 3 duikbote gekoop van die Franse af. Daar was die ander Maria van Riebeeck en Emily Habers was die ander 2. In 1999, soos met baie naamsveranderinge, is haar naam verander na die SAS Assegai en 'n nuwe wapen dan ook het sy gekry. Aan die einde van in 28 November 2003 is die Assegai finaal uit diens uitgeneem, saam met die ander duikbote ook, want op daai stadium het ons nuwe duikbote gekoop, nog 3 duikbote, weer 'n keer 3 duikbote, maar die keer was dit van die Duitsers af. Tipe 209 duikboot, so ons het nie genoeg bemannings gehad vir die ou Franse duikbote plus die nuwes nie, so die ou Franse duikbote is toe uit diens uitgeneem, en die SAS Assegai is in 2003 vir die laaste keer uit diens uitgeneem. Soos wat nou maar gebeur oor tyd, raak die duikbote redelik verwaarloos as hulle net langs aan lê en van die 3 duikbote is 2 eintlik opgesny. Julle kan dink dit is metaal en daar's baie goeders wat mense weer kan herwin. So 2 van die duikbote is toe opgesny. Let me just switch to English, sorry. So 2 of the 3 Daphne class submarines were actually cut up for scrap, and the third one, Assegai, there was an attempt to save it and to preserve the Assegai as a submarine museum. Many years later, after being taken out of service and lots of fighting back and forth between the Navy and those that wanted to preserve it, it was eventually during last year, an agreement was reached where the Naval Heritage Trust would actually run the submarine museum, and it would still be part of the South African Navy Museum. So initially it was in the submarine. Assegai was in the dockyard in Simonstown, where it started to look fairly shabby on the outside. Fortunately, inside still in fairly good condition. So it had been in the dockyard for many years. The Navy had said they were going to undertake maintenance of it, but obviously, I mean, as you all have read, the Navy and the armed forces generally, the Defence Force, is struggling to keep the equipment going that they have now. So there certainly isn't money for trying to save an outdated submarine. So in the end, it was a couple of volunteers who were really keen about it, and also in the end, the city of Cape Town actually realised that this could actually be quite a good tourism event as well. So they donated some money as well. So eventually, it was possible to move the submarine out of the dockyard where it was, where nobody could actually get entrance or get access to it. So they moved it out of the dockyard into an area that was closed off, that was part of the parking area in Simonstown. And that's where they eventually got it here. It took quite an effort to get it here. As you can imagine, it's a fairly heavy object to move and a fairly limited space. So that's what it looked when they eventually got it to the site where the submarine was going to be preserved. And that's what it actually looks like now. So it's the only submarine museum in Africa. What's happened here, you see there's 2 sets of staircases, and they cut a doorway in the side of the submarine. So the idea is that you would come in, enter the submarine with that stairway, move through the submarine, and then you move out here. So there's a flow of people moving through. So if ever you are in Simonstown, it certainly is worthwhile visiting. It costs you 80 Rand to enter for an adult. And you go through as part of a tour. So you don't go walking through it on your own. There's little tour groups that are with volunteers again, as with all of these things. that would then take you through the submarine and explain the various aspects. There's also a small submarine museum on the site, just to the right there, where that prefab building is. There's a little submarine and a reception area and bathrooms and everything else. There's also become a wall of remembrance, in fact. It's alongside the submarine as well on the wall there. You may recall, probably 3 years ago or so now, a couple of officers and sailors were washed off the upper deck of one of the new submarines and drowned. So it's actually a wall of remembrance to sailors that died in submarines as well. So it's well worth a visit. It's in Simonstown. You'll quite easily find it. It is signposted there. I don't know if there are any other questions about the Assegai. Thank you very much for those that did donate for the preservation. It was worthwhile. It worked.
Nobody told them that they're supposed to board on the port side.
There's a guy who's going to do well in the test. Oh, is that so? Okay. Okay. Carl has been aboard as well. He knows the submarine too. All right. Okay, well, folks, that's all. Thank you very much.